Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I know we're going to have a few extra people continue to join us. We like to do these snack size 30-minute webinar in and out. So we're going to get started and we are excited that you are here to join us. So as I mentioned, or if you're just joining us, I'm Jodi Daniels. I'm a CEO and privacy consultant at Clover Advisors. Everything we do is all about helping companies comply with privacy laws and making complying with data privacy simpler and ultimately establishing trust with customers, which is why I love this topic so much. And with me today, I have one of my favorite people. So JJ, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jodi. Thanks for having us, and good to see you. So I'm a Ketch privacy management software. Our specialty is on basically the management of data. How do you attach permissions and privacy wherever that needs to go? And so we think about it from that data perspective. And I'm head of solutions over there. Jodi, it's one of the things I loved about you when we first met is this emphasis on trust and the consumer and marketing at the core of privacy. So I'm glad we're talking about this today.
Well, I am so excited. So for everyone here, let's talk about our agenda. Because then we're going to actually take the slides away and you're going to just see some really cool heads. We firmly believe that privacy and trust is a selling point. We're going to share some examples and some tips about how to equip your sales team, whether you're B2B or B2C. And then why do consumers care about how you handle their data? And we will sprinkle actionable tips throughout. Some admin things, yes, this will be recorded, and yes, the recording will be shared with you. There also should be the ability for you to ask some questions. So if you have them, feel free to put them in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing. And did that actually work? I can figure these things out. Oh, actually, first we're going to launch a poll. So we have 3 polls to kind of make it cool and fun and interesting. So the first one is going to be the sales process poll. So right now, during the sales process, has your company ever lost a sale due to a weak or a non-existent privacy program? We'll give you just a few moments to answer. Here's where I need that cool music again. That would be a brilliant feature to add in where you could play music while people are doing the poll. All right, I see a few more people coming in. Ding, ding, ding. I'm going to give you 5 more seconds. Okay, I am ending the poll and I'm sharing results. So we have 15% who say absolutely, 20% who said nope, and a whole lot of you who are not sure. So we're going to talk about how we can figure this out and also a little bit about some examples and where this might show up. So I see this all the time in a B2B context. And JJ, I was hoping that you could start us off with some of the examples that you've seen in your line of work, and then, I'll kind of share some of ours as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jodi. Well, for us, I mean, just personally, as a startup, right? I mean, keep saying startup, we're a few years old now, but as a startup, and this kind of reminds me of a story that was at a startup we had prior to Ketch called Crux, where we were in a deal, and then, it was looking good, and then somebody said on the other side, hey, do you have SOC 2 compliance? You have your SOC 2 attestation. Everybody was looking at each other like, what's SOC 2, man? And this thing like slowed down the deal. And the interesting thing about that is we're seeing it today in privacy, right? Because it's easy to see privacy as just a compliance thing, of course. But the things that really grow businesses, especially businesses like ours, or any technology company, is when the solution you're providing helps provide revenue or stops or is a gate to revenue. And so we've had a couple of examples of this. One of these, and this is a European example, you see the due diligence questionnaires. You see like sometimes it's a super fancy standard like ISO 27701 that says here's the box you need to tick on privacy. And the example we work with, one of our clients, they're winning like most companies, they win 30 to 40% of their deals, pretty normal. And what they found is that there was a lot of deals that they just weren't even seeing, didn't even have the opportunity to participate in because they weren't ticking this box on this ISO standard super early in their discussions. And so it was simple math for them. How many deals weren't we seeing? if we tick this box, how many do we start seeing? And they started to see like 10% more. And then that math flows down. And if we win 30% of those and our average deal volume is 65 grand or whatever it is, it becomes a real number. And really all it is this box tick. So that's kind of one example. That's a European example. But in the US, where maybe our standards aren't as formalized as ISO, I know there's NIST and others, we're still seeing the question on due diligence questionnaires. And so one of the ways that we see it, which is kind of interesting, is we do a lot of work with digital media companies. And so, as we kind of said earlier in the call, Jodi, like we're all about consumers and trust, right? And so we did a study a couple of years back on how much do consumers actually care about privacy? What motivates them, So I'm all about that. So I was talking to one of our digital media clients and I asked like, hey, you're doing this privacy thing because you care about consumers, right? Because you care about trust like we do. And the response was funny because they said, yeah, we do. But actually our advertisers care about this. So think about a publisher and, they've got all these advertising revenue that flows from data that they're collecting from consumers. And actually not being able to answer the privacy question right threatens that. So even though it wasn't a formal ISO standard, it was still something that really threatened a ton of revenue for them. So that's kind of two examples, US and Europe. I mean, what have you seen?
Well, you see it a lot, especially in a B2B software or service environment where a contract comes down and part of those requirements, whether it's an assessment or the contract, is you have to comply with GDPR. You have to comply with CCPA. And those companies aren't prepared. They thought that they didn't need to for whatever reason. That deal will not go forward until they can show compliance. Now that company is scrambling. And I also see a variety of companies, and I have a few where they do care about privacy, but they're not communicating it well. So the sales team actually has different answers. And the entire process is slowed down because now they have to go to legal, they have to go to compliance, they have to get their answers, they have to go to security, they have to package it all up. And it's like the bouncing bean. Anyone here who's ever tried to get a contract through a company probably knows how maybe not quickly that happens. Now add on the privacy and security pieces. That's just going to even further delay everything. The companies instead who create a standard database of answers, they create standard sales sheets with the information about the privacy and security programs to address the customer questions up front, are in a much better position and are able to close that deal sooner and avoid all the back and forth.
Yep, that's exactly it, Jodi. And this like reframing of privacy as something that helps revenue. It has been a game changer for us because I mean, you know how it gets when you're just talking about compliance to some people.
Yeah. We could talk about compliance all day.
Right.
Another place that I'm seeing it, and as a software provider, you're likely getting questions about your own practices. I'm seeing this more and more with AI, where companies are now really enhancing their vendor processes. I always kind of find this interesting because we talk about privacy pros all the time. You should have these vendor processes. Well, if you're a company listening today and you're trying to get other parts of your organization paying attention, AI is one of those places that might help you here because so many companies are focused on what is that organization doing in a training model? They're asking the questions. It's kind of the same now. It's always been of who's the third party and what are they doing with the data. So from a B2B organization, if you can address those questions, you're going to up front, you're going to be able to speed along your sales process.
It's so well said, Jodi. And actually, we've seen this with AI because as we look at AI, Gen AI, right, I should say, over the last, let's just say 18 months, there's been this maturity in how the market looks at it. Like it was, I guess November 22, when the whole Gen AI, open AI thing came out, it was shiny new toy syndrome, right? Like, hey, we've got to get this in there. And then there was, kind of March last year, started to think about maybe the risks and how do we do this and operationally, what do we actually need to do? What are the use cases? And then kind of early this year, late last year, people actually started asking real questions about the ROI from this and what is the ROI and how do we operationalize this? And everybody's at different stages of that journey. But when you start thinking about ROI, I think you have to start thinking, is my data set something that I can use for this? And one of the words that we hear people use a lot is, am I allowed, like, do I have permission to use this? Can I do it? For all the things you said, right? Can I push this data into a model? If I do, what does it need to look like? Does it need to be anonymized? How do you identify does it have to be? Can I pull it back once it's in there? Is it explainable? Like, all these questions start to pop up. And for us, we kind of reframed it as permission. Do you have a permission data set? We're having a lot of conversations with CDPs and cloud data warehouses and whatnot to figure out, how do you get to this point where people are confident that the data they have is ready to rock, and ready to rock for AI because it unlocks this ROI opportunity.
I like the ready to rock. That one's fun. So I want to make this really practical. And we've kind of covered B2B as our first area. For people listening, what would be your takeaway for those listening who are in the B2B space?
Well, you were asking the crowd.
Yeah, I'm asking you.
Asking me. My takeaway for the B2B space is just do the thing, man. Like you said, you got to do the thing. You got to have your privacy management processes in place. But I think what you said, Jodi, was, don't just wait to see it in an RFP. Like, just be out there with it, right? And here's what we do, and we do this right. And I think that gives people a lot of comfort. We're seeing this idea that, can I use this data, especially with third-party cookies going away, generally, right? This movement towards first-party data relationships. And when you have first-party data relationships, it opens up second-party and collaboration, right, between two entities that might have first-party data. When you're sharing data like that, you have to ask the question, am I allowed to do this? And so, like, having those conversations early, I think unlocks a lot of opportunity for folks.
I delivered a training earlier today, and we had the exact conversation of, the first question might be, can you use this data from a regulatory standpoint? And then the next question is, should you use this data? And you need to have the conversation of should you or shouldn't you? And as it relates to the sales process, really, my takeaway tip for everyone listening in the B2B side is going to be, really think about, how are you using the data and what are the common questions you keep getting time and time again from customers? That is an amazing opportunity for you to package that up, put it in an FAQ, put it in a trust center, put it in bullets somewhere in your site, a one-pager as a part of the process. The more you're already doing that for all the product features, here's why you should buy my service or my product. Now we want to address the privacy piece and to be able to get it right up there. So with that being said, we're going to launch our second poll, everybody. Benefits of a strong privacy program. What do you believe is the biggest benefit to a strong privacy program when it comes to setting up your sales team for success? Do you believe it's building customer trust, enhancing a brand reputation, differentiating your offerings, or reducing the sales cycle? So we've talked about almost each of these in our conversation. Here's our beautiful music. Do, 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 do. And then we're going to move to B2C next, for those of you who might be in the B2C space. All right, I'm going to give you just a few more moments. Almost everyone here. All right, ending the poll, sharing the results. Oh, JJ, tell me, what are your immediate thoughts based on these results, with 55% believing it can build trust?
I believe the build trust thing, I think that's what I would have picked as well. For me, brand reputation kind of rolls up into that, so you could probably use those interchangeably. There's more to it than just customer trust, of course, but like, I'm surprised differentiate your offerings was so small there. Because I think it can, but yeah, and sales cycle time, totally, that's what we've been talking about.
Right. I really believe it can reduce the sales cycle time, because if you think about all those different questions that you're getting, and if you're a company who has to keep answering them uniquely every single time, or if you're going back and forth between gathering information about how you as an organization can comply with XYZ privacy law and help with the obligations for that company, that's just precious time. And the more you can feed that earlier in the process, actually, when a company is evaluating you, that's going to help on the customer trust and brand reputation part. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit to B2C. So we've talked about some really obvious examples for B2B where we see this all the time. But what about B2C? Sometimes we just are connecting with consumers on a screen. We don't even, get to talk to humans. So what are some of the examples that you're seeing with the companies you're working with and how they're approaching this?
So Jodi, this is one of my favorite topics. So let me know where you want to go on this. I think that generally, and our clients share this, there's going to be a consumer awakening if we're not there already on privacy and how, and it's not privacy, but more like are brands using my data responsibly? Like that day is coming. And so if it's not here already, one of like important tipping points for me in understanding like how much do consumers understand this? Because I don't think we're giving them enough credit actually. I think consumers understand the value exchange with brands really, really well, and they've understood it for a long time. They've understood it all the way back to when we had soap operas like Days of Our Lives, sponsored by P&G, and they knew, right? Hey, I'm going to buy your
Did you
soap.
watch soap operas?
Totally. So no, that's how I learned English. No, it's like this is it's like I'm going to watch your show and I'm going to be delighted by the show, and I get it that there's a transaction here, right? And so I think the internet works in a very similar way. So consumers understand I'm going to give my data, I'm going to get something back. And it doesn't have to be as obvious as a discount. It can just be a brand experience or whatever the case may be. So consumers understand this, right? And one of the tipping points, I think, was remember the GM LexisNexis example? New York Times was all over it. They're like, hey, do you know there's this company called LexisNexis that's getting your vehicle data and they're selling it to insurers, doing all sorts of stuff. What's interesting about that is every story like that raises consumer awareness. I think every action that the FTC does raises consumer awareness. What's interesting about this one was there was no regulator. It was the New York Times, it was GM, it was LexisNexis. 2 weeks after that New York Times article, GM pulled the practice. Hey, we're not doing this anymore. So like that for me was okay, so you care about this, right? Consumers are seeing what you're doing. And it's all movements towards more transparency on what happens with data. And that's going to have flow-on effects on how all of us communicate with consumers.
I love that story. And as someone who used to want to be a journalist, I always actually wanted to be a broadcast journalist, but I always used to do newspaper when I was younger. I think that's where more consumers are going to learn about what's actually happening is in the media. And now privacy is getting media attention more and more with different IoT devices and what they're collecting and how they're using it. We see it a ton on social media and how they're utilizing information. And we also have from the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, really looking in particular sectors, especially in the health environment, and then you also have, I think, this influx of AI and drones and surveillance, and you kind of are blending all of these different pieces together. So more is coming out in the news. More of the other areas designed to protect consumers are, I think, ramping up their activities, and then it's getting out in the news. So it's not so quiet anymore. And if you just type in privacy news, there's a lot as a consumer that can learn about it.
No, totally, Jodi. And so, for example, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, and there was a ton of attention on how health data is being used, how location data can be used, and like its potential to be weaponized, right? And we started to see as consumers, right, not even just privacy professionals, we started to see things like period tracking apps. Like when we had our first kid, we had this little app that would tell you what size fruit they were, and it was like, oh, it was a mango, and it was like, oh, whatever. And it was fun, right? And then kind of in hindsight, it's like, shit, what were you doing with that data actually, right? Because were they selling it? They knew that there's a new mom on the horizon. And kind of what we know about brand advertising and marketing is that, women who become new moms change like long held brand beliefs at that moment in time. Like you could have been loving a brand for decades and it swaps in that moment. So it's really vulnerable. And so I think there's an awareness of health data and all these apps. And are they using more than what you would reasonably expect them to, right? So I think that's an interesting thing. And as you mentioned with the FTC, one of the things I think is fascinating with what they're doing recently, which I think will highlight to consumers maybe something that will piss them off, we know the FTC talks about marketing and targeted advertising as commercial surveillance, right? That's kind of and we're all like, come on, man, it's not quite commercial surveillance. It's advertising. There's a value exchange. Like, I think that's probably one area where I don't agree with some of the rhetoric there. But the new thing they're doing, which they just announced, which they call surveillance pricing, and I think they've asked 8 or 10 companies what their practices are here. Surveillance pricing is basically, I'm going to use your data to give you a different price, which I worry about a lot on Airbnb. I'm like, am I getting the same price actually as whoever? And I was having a great discussion with our PR team on this, because our PR team, they write they write bylines for billionaires, right? And part of that, she's like, you know what? I get private jet ads, and it's like, okay, this is how it works, right? It's like that's exactly how it works. So I wonder if our writer has to pay more because of her job. And so this idea of surveillance pricing, and now you're going to get an individual number, I think that's going to scare consumers, right? And the FTC is all over it. So there's this laddering up of awareness where I think it just becomes like inevitable.
And I think depending on the kind of brand that some companies are, they're more susceptible. So there's a couple different social media posts I've seen, for example, on some really sensitive organizations. And the post will be all about, I told you they're a private company, they can sell your data because they were sold to a PE firm. And the thought was that's private data that's really sensitive. There's no controls over it. And then you have all these consumers having conversation that goes exactly to the heart of customer trust and reputation that we were just speaking about. Anyone listening here, why have you chosen to not answer questions truthfully when they're asking you something personal about your family or how much you make or anything else? Because you have to answer the question and keep going in the process. That's how they've designed it. But you don't actually want to give them the information because you don't feel like you know what they're going to do with it. Everyone here, you don't have to say, but I know you all have done it. And the same is kind of true from the wallet perspective. That one's a little bit more security, but we're seeing the same concept from the kind of data I feel comfortable. The wallet meaning you don't want to give them your credit card. You'd rather give an Amazon Pay, an Apple Pay, a PayPal, something else, because you don't want them to have the data. That right there is the tension of trust.
Totally, Jodi. And I think that trust has eroded. And I think one of the drivers for that erosion is brands are so freaked out that third-party data is going away, and they're doing everything they can to build first-party data relationships with their customers. I see this manifest, which is the right move, by the way, but you got to do it the right way. The way I see it manifest, just personally, every shop I walk into now, they're like, "Oh, can I have your phone number? Can I have your email?" Like it's the first question, and so I'm like, "Well, why?" I'm like, "Well, so we can look you up in our system." I'm like, "Really? You need my number to look me up in the system?" And he's like, "You're not going to do anything else with it, just that." And it just seems crazy. And so there's this, I think, a lack of training and a lack of process on what the customer experience looks like when you're going out and trying to collect first-party data. And so I think brands need to think about that, because if this trust is eroding, which for me personally it is, and I see it all the time, how do you do a better job of that? And I think it just comes down to these principles of tell people what you're going to do with their data, be super transparent about it, give them controls over it, let them come back anytime and make that tweak if they're not comfortable with the data that they gave you. Right? Really it comes down to those two elements for me.
Absolutely. And how you deliver that information and how you're transparent can also be a really big driver as to how successful all of that's going to be. So for example, Lego has been favorably in the news amongst privacy pros because they've done such a creative job in line with their philosophy of how to communicate, here's what's happening with data. So the Lego group created a really interactive, smart, age-appropriate privacy notice to very simply explain to the people who might be using it at that age, here's what's happening with your data. And I think you can right size to what your scenario is. Really curious if you have any other examples that you've seen of people kind of doing notice and choice in a really clear way.
It doesn't have to be a boring legal thing, right? It can be fun, it can be informative. That Lego video was one of my favorite examples of that. What I liked about it is it's like, oh, I even understood something about how cookies work. When I watched this little Lego guy rolling around. And it kind of really cinched the point for me that you're talking to the audience. Like one of my pet peeves is, I think the German regulator had a YouTube on this. You take your average phone and it's got, how many apps on it. And if you read the privacy policies and disclaimers on each one of those apps, it takes you like 17 hours. So this idea that consumers are getting it and they're reading these things, maybe they're actually designed not to be read, right? Is actually one of the things in mind here is like, well, they're not. And this idea of informed consent, which is not there. Like if it's a 100-page document that you're attaching to an app that, I mean, give me one person that's read it, really, right? And so what I saw from Lego was super refreshing. I like some of the work that Airbnb is doing, at least the way that they approach bias in their systems. Like I thought it was super clear. They talked about, for example, hey, we want to see if certain ethnicities aren't able to rent homes from Airbnb. So here's the study that we're doing. And we're not collecting your data, we're just collecting this, and this, and for what we need for the study. It was super transparent. They also said, hey, we work with the Civil Liberties Union and other kind of bodies. And so you have this feeling that, okay, I see what you're trying to do and it's a good thing. And I see the data you're collecting to do it. And I see that it's directly tied to it. And I see that you've worked with some bodies who understand the space. And so that for me was an example of a lot of comfort, which walking into a store like, hey man, can we have your phone number to look you up on my system? Like just is the total opposite of that.
Absolutely. So in the spirit of being actionable, I'm going to share my tip for the B2C market. And then JJ, I'd love for you to share yours. For me, those trust centers and preference centers and really clear language is pivotal, especially in the consumer market. They don't always spend as much time going through the sales cycle when it comes to this information. So really clear, beautiful icons or pictures, colors. They can be boxes, they can be the pictures or icons, the video, hyperlinks, just making it not that long, boring notice. You have to have that to meet the regulatory requirement. They say that. It has to be concise and short and include all these things at the same time. That all right there is a challenge. So pull out the important pieces that someone is going to read, because no one's going to spend 17 hours reading everything, but they are going to go to, okay, so I'm giving you my really sensitive information. Tell me what you're going to do with it. Like I have a facial recognition software for my campers. I want to know what you're doing. I don't want to go through 5,000 pictures. Thank you. But before I sign up for that, tell me what you're doing with that picture. And I can zero in on what's happening with that software. So transparency and making it a cool privacy center is going to be my tip. JJ, what's yours?
Jodi, transparency is absolutely one for me. And what I would add control to that. And so I think we need to give consumers more control over how that data is used. One of the ways I think about this, and what we see happening a lot, is as brands are sending data wherever they're sending it, downstream, other vendors, they're sharing it, they're doing the thing. Most of the time, there's a contract with that vendor, contract with that data system. And I think the contracts aren't enough. I mean, there's a level of technical control you need. So that if somebody comes in as a consumer and says, hey, I've changed my mind, I opt out of that. Opt out of giving you my email for that purpose, that needs to flow down everywhere it needs to flow down to in a programmatic way. So that's been our thing for a while, and I think that builds trust. And I think that's where the world is going a little. I think we will end up with a SOC 2 privacy that will demand this.
Absolutely. Nothing is more frustrating than I opt out and then you keep getting everything. And I don't want to opt out of all those places. I gave it to you. Just make it work. Figure out how that works. We have just a few moments. I really do want to launch this last poll because I think it'll be really important for the collective group that's here. In what ways have you coached your sales team to communicate the commitments you've made to data privacy requirements and protecting data? Understand key principles, highlight certifications and compliance, emphasize customer trust and security, detail specific measures and technology, or you like all of our options, and so all of the above. While you all are voting, I encourage you to follow JJ and Ketch on social. They have some really fun and clever posts. As always, please do continue to follow my content, Red Clover. We try and put out a lot of content as well to help educate in this space. We're so grateful that you joined us today. let me share the results because I think it will be really valuable for you all to see where are other companies doing. The customer trust and security aligns with what we saw earlier. So that's a really big focus area. And then many of you, almost 40%, are really doing all of the above. There's a few of you who are doing none. So pick one that you like here. That's your action item tip for today. And I thank you for joining us. We will send out the recording. Please do follow us on social. If you have any other questions or comments, you can always reach out to us. And we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks, Jodi.
Thanks, JJ, for joining us.
Thank you.